Well, welcome everyone to day 2 of the Creativity Expert Exchange. For those of you who are joining us today for the first time, I'm Roger Firestein. I'm the Senior Faculty and Associate Professor in the Creativity and Change Leadership Department at Buffalo State University. For those of you that were with us yesterday, I'm still Roger Firestein. I haven't changed my identity, just saying. Today, and the conference, we are delighted that we're welcoming over 500 participants from across the United States and from around the world. If you want to take a look in the chat, there is a map of where they were all from yesterday that's been posted. Exciting stuff. As I mentioned yesterday, I'd like to give you a little history today to those folks who are joining us today. The Creativity Expert Exchange began in the late 1990s. And it was the intention of faculty and alumni and current students to share some of their latest findings, both in the research area and from the field of practice. And over the years, we've expanded this to really expand the reach of the conference to include people that are doing interesting work in just about any aspect of creativity, both within the Creativity and Change Leadership Department and from other areas as well. And when we use the word expert, what we mean is we mean people that are working in the field of creativity, training creativity and innovation programs and organizations, writers, and those of you that are passionate about how you apply creativity in your life. And if you're passionate about how you apply creativity in your life, you're in the right place. And this is the cue for applause. So applause, everyone. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Oh, I love this. All these wonderful faces applauding. Yesterday and today, we have 16 sessions from more than 20 presenters. And just some logistics today during the program, please remember to mute your microphone. Make sure that your name matches your registration. You can turn your camera off, but actually most of us, many of the presenters prefer to have your camera on. So if you're comfortable, make sure that you have your camera on. Be in speaker view, communicate in the chat. And gentlemen, as yesterday, as I mentioned, please wear pants. Some of our concurrent session presenters in the program are really going to encourage you to have your cameras on, so just keep that in mind. So that makes us feel great when we get to see you. So I'd like to take a moment now to just review our agenda for today, and we're going to post that. And here it is. Here's some information on us for us, and let's go to the next slide. And here we have it. Okay, so at 10 o'clock or very quickly after we're through here, Dr. Roni Reiter Palnon is going to be talking about creativity in teams. And she will go to about 11 o'clock. And then we have two wonderful panelists, Dr. Karen Tilstra and Laura Swatowski. They're going to respond to Dr. Roni Reiter Palmon's comments, and then we'll open it up for a discussion from you folks. And once again, if you have questions during Dr. Reiter Palmon's talk, just put them in the chat. I'll be watching the chat, and I'll try to relay some of those a little bit later. We're going to be, we will have a break from 11:30 to 12:15 New York time. And for those of you that are interested in the graduate program in Creativity and Change Leadership, our executive credentials, the SUNY Advanced Graduate Certificate, or the master's program, Dr. Udis and Dr. Puccio will be available to chat in the designated Zoom room. And this link to the Zoom room is in the program and in the document that we posted in the chat box. We've also sent you all out a document about the links today. We apologize about the link yesterday. We just had a little challenge with that. We've corrected those links, and that's in that document that we sent you, also the document in the chat. Also, for those of you that might be interested in our graduate program, we have an information session on March 16th. At 12 o'clock New York time and at 4 o'clock New York time. And the link and the registration for that will be in the chat. Also, during the 11:30 to 12:15 break, the main room will be open for anyone who wishes to network and just kind of talk with other folks. So we'll have that open for you. Concurrent sessions will then begin at 12:15 to 1 o'clock in the New York time zone. We'll take a break from 1 o'clock to 1:15 in the New York time zone. And that will be followed by our second block of concurrent sessions, which runs from 1:15 to 2 o'clock, with a wrap-up of the conference from 2 o'clock to 2:15 in your concurrent session rooms. And you can see that there in the schedule that we have posted there. The links to the concurrent sessions are found in the program and in the document that we posted. You're not obligated to go to the concurrent sessions you indicated when you registered. This is a creativity conference, so change your mind, move around, Jump into any session. There's wonderful things going on there. Dr. Puccio has just put the link in for the virtual open house in the chat, so you might want to check that. As we mentioned yesterday, if the Zoom meeting goes down, don't worry. We're going to record the whole session. We'll make them available after the conference. Also, sessions that were done yesterday are also recorded, and we'll make those available to you after the conference as well. As we mentioned yesterday, this conference is free, but there are some costs associated with running a conference of this magnitude, and we really appreciate your contributions. We want to thank you for those of you that donated to the Parnes Donor Scholarship Fund. Our students, thank you for that. If you've not donated yet and would like to, you can still make a donation to support the conference, to support the work that we do here. You can do that through your Eventbrite link. That's going to be available through Monday at 5 o'clock. You just need to go back to the link, re-register, and just click the donate box. And we've received over $2,000 in donations so far. We really appreciate that. We thank you for that. And that what really keeps these programs moving. Also, big news for next year. We have the next Creativity Expert Exchange scheduled. Mark your calendars. It's going to be Thursday and Friday, March 7th and 8th, 2024. Once again, the Creativity Expert Exchange in 2024 will be March 7th and 8th. So mark your calendars, please plan to be there. We'll keep you in touch between now and then. We will end the Creativity Expert Exchange in your respective breakout sessions. We won't come back to the Zoom room. So your chance to be together will be over the 11:30 to 12:15 New York time break. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our keynote presenter for today. And as I mentioned, after Dr. Reiter Palnon, we're going to have a panel with Laura Swatowski and Dr. Karen Tilstra. They will take about 5 minutes to respond to Dr. Reiter Palmon's work, and then we will open it up for questions. So let me just give you a little background on Dr. Roni Reiter Palnon. She's Distinguished Professor of Industrial Organizational Psychology and Director of the IO Psychology Graduate Program at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She's also the Director of Innovation for the Center for Collaboration Science and Interdisciplinary Program at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Dr. Reiter Palmon's research focuses on creativity and innovation in the workplace, team creativity, development of teamwork and creative problem-solving skills, and leading creative teams and individuals. Her research has been published in leading journals such as the Journal of Applied Psychology, Creativity Research Journal, the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity in the Arts, Human Resources Management, and Leadership Quarterly. She's published 4 edited books on the topic of creativity and is the editor of the book series Creativity and Innovation in Organizations, published by Palgrave. She's obtained over $8 million in grant and contract funding from government and businesses focusing on creativity, leadership, and teams. And she's president-elect of Division 10 of the American Psychological Association for Creativity. Dr. Reiter Palnon, I don't know when you sleep, all right? So, and Dr. Reiter Palnon, I just want to also mention to you that I quoted a number of your studies on problem construction in my new book, Solve the Real Problem. Thank you for your work in the field. It is an absolute honor to introduce you today to speak on the topic of creativity and teams. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Roni Reiter Palnon. Round of applause for Dr. Reiter Palnon. So, thank you, Roni.
Thank you, Roger, for this beautiful introduction. And it's, as a scientist, a researcher, it's always a pleasure to hear that people find my work useful. So with that, I want to share my screen and share the presentation, which means that I won't see you guys. So if now is your chance to turn off your cameras if you really want to. It won't bother me because I will just see my slides. Roger, feel free to jump in with questions. I'm terrible about following the chat when I'm presenting.
Roni, don't worry about the chat. I'll watch that for you. Perfect. And we'll have you go to about 11 o'clock if that works for you, and then we'll bring our panelists on. So great, yeah.
Sounds
don't
great.
Worry about the chat. You've got a lot to do.
Yes, and I just multitasking is not real.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
So I try to tell that to my students. They don't always believe me. So what I want to talk to you about today is an area that I've started studying really in somewhere about 2010 or so. So it's more, relatively speaking, a more recent area of my own work. And that's team creativity and innovation. Specifically, what I am interested in is the team social and cognitive processes and how those interrelate. So I'll talk a little bit about team social processes that facilitate or inhibit creativity. I'll talk a little bit about some cognitive processes, and then hopefully from there we could have a conversation. I also want to encourage everybody to reach out to me. My last slide will include contact information. I'm always happy to talk about creativity and the work that I do. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out. So, what started all of this is really, and I have this slide, but for you guys, it's I don't have to convince you that creativity is important. So yes, it's important. We know it's important. It really is important for today's workplace in particular, and that's sort of the thought process that I have as an organizational psychologist. I also don't need to define to you what creativity is, but I always like to have this slide just to remind ourselves that we're talking about any product, process, or solution that is both original or novel, as well as useful or appropriate. And again, this comes from much more of a IO psychology business perspective, where usefulness or appropriateness has a particular meaning. But this is the definition Teresa Mabile, which we talked about earlier, uses, Mike Mumford, and many others in this field. So why do we need to study creativity in teams? One of the things that we're seeing happening in businesses, but also in the world around us, that the complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve is increasing. I don't know if we solved all the simple problems, but it sure feels that way. So the notion is that we will get additional performance benefits by having a team, and especially when we have a team that has varied skills, right? So team members have different strengths. They will bring those different strengths to the table, and that will facilitate creative problem solving. There's also in the teams literature focus on team adaptation. So how do teams adapt to changes in requirements, in markets, and so on, with basically businesses in the world shifting very, very quickly, and that requires rapid changes in how we approach problems, what problems we're trying to solve, how businesses adapt to the new environment. And really, if you look at the definitions of adaptation, they're highly related to creativity. And the way I like to think about it is that when we engage in creativity, that requires adaptation. We're suggesting something new, and that requires the team to adapt. Not all adaptation requires creativity, though. So, but all creativity requires adaptation. So when we look at team creativity, a lot of the early work focused on individual level creativity and focused on the team as a contextual variable. So what does the team look like that facilitates individual creativity within the team? So the team was the background and the individual was in the center. But over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a move toward looking at team creativity as the focus, where the team is the focus. So the team is producing an outcome, and that's of the outcome of interest. So you can have more or less creative individuals in the team. It's really that synergy that happens within the team that results in a particular outcome that we're interested in. So the unit of analysis moved from the individual to the team, and that changed how we think about things. The approach that I tend to use is a fairly old one, fairly simple, but very useful, developed by McGrath. It's been revised a few times, but the core of it is the input, process, output. So the output in this particular case is always creativity. That's what we're interested in. In the input, we see various team characteristics, including team diversity. The processes, I'm specifically going to talk about social and cognitive processes. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a discussion about team diversity and how teams can be diverse, and then what do we know about creativity from that. So when we look at diversity in teams, we look at demographic characteristics, right? So teams can be diverse in terms of their gender, age, ethnicity, nationality, or culture. There's quite a bit of research on this, but the research tends to focus on one variable at a time. So are teams diverse in terms of gender? Are teams diverse in terms of race or ethnicity? Personal characteristics like personality, motivation, or values received a little bit of attention, but there's very limited research. But I did want to mention that exists. And then we have functional diversity, meaning what is the job or position that you hold? What department do you come from? What is your educational background or discipline? And those relate directly to your job and position. And in a meta-analysis that was done in 2009, Hulschiger et al. Looked at a whole host of variables related to team creativity. But in terms of this diversity, they basically found that demographic diversity was not related to creativity, but they found that functional diversity was positively related to creativity. So teams that had functional diversity showed higher creativity. Demographic diversity did not tend to do anything, and there was really not enough information on personal characteristics, and there still isn't. I want to push back a little bit on the demographic diversity piece and argue that I think that there are reasons why they could not find that demographic diversity is related to creativity. The first issue with that is that, as I said, most studies focus on one demographic characteristic at a time. You know, we are much more aware of intersectionality today than we were before, and that applies to those demographically diverse teams. We very rarely have studies that look at that and look at that intentionally. The second part is that they did not separate whether the demographic diversity had a meaningful effect on the task that was evaluated. So in some cases, for example, if we're trying to develop new tools to assist older individuals to live independently, age differences will be relevant. Gender differences may be relevant. But if the task is something that is not related to gender or age, we may not see differences. They just lumped all those demographic diversity studies into one group, which means we can't determine whether demographic diversity is helpful in certain conditions, for example, when the task is relevant to the diversity variable you're looking at. So when we look at teams and sort of evaluate the general teams literature, what are the strengths of having a diverse team, and especially when we talk about functional diversity? Teams that are diverse have more information available to them and more diverse information. So if you think about any interdisciplinary team that you worked on, and I've worked on a number of those teams, I bring the psychological perspective. My engineer colleague brings the engineering perspective. My computer science colleague brings the computer science perspective, and so on. They have access to research that I don't traditionally read. They have methodologies and approaches that I don't usually use. We provide different perspectives and more of them. So basically, the benefits of a diverse team are informational. They're cognitive. But what we also know is that in diverse teams, and these could be demographically diverse teams, functionally diverse teams, we have more difficulty in communicating. If you work in an interdisciplinary team, you know that sometimes it can take you several months to figure out a shared vocabulary, because you say something and it gets interpreted differently because they're looking at it from a different lens. And that communication difficulty creates more difficulties in developing trust and sharing information. Those are all social deficits. And we'll come back to that, sort of wrap up with that at the end of the presentation. So starting with social processes, when I started to look at social processes and try to see how those relate to creativity, I started with, okay, what do the experts that study teams tell us about social processes in teams, regardless of what the outcome of interest is? It could be effectiveness, it could be team efficiency, whatever it is. So looking at those, I identified 3 big models of social processes, and they all had 3 things in common. One big issue that they all talked about was communication. The other one was trust and psychological safety, and then conflict in teams. So looking at these specific processes, what do we know about them and how do they relate to creativity? So the first thing is that when we talk about communication, we typically look at both internal communication, that is within the team, and external communication outside of the team. And outside of the team can be within the organization. So we talk to other departments or other teams within our department, but it also can be completely outside the organization, like with customers or suppliers or the general public. So external communication seems to be one of the strongest predictors of team creativity. We find that diverse teams also engage in more external communication. And the reason they engage in more external communication is because they have different networks of people that they know. So if you have a team that's all organizational psychologists, we all know the same people. So we communicate within the same group, even outside of our own group. You talk to people that are not organizational psychologists, but other kinds of psychologists, the network increases. You talk to people outside of psychology, the network further increases. So that piece of external communication becomes really important for creativity, and diverse teams engage in more of that. Why is external communication so important? Again, that external communication can provide us with additional information. If we have diverse teams and diverse networks, we can get diverse information. That has been supported by research on weak ties. Particularly Jill Perry-Smith has done some wonderful work on weak ties. So we think about weak ties, it's a sociological construct for those of you that are not familiar. It's our acquaintances as opposed to our friends. Friends are strong ties, acquaintances are weak ties. The more weak ties you have and the more diverse your weak ties are, the more likely you are to be creative, or your team is to be creative. The other thing that happens is that when we talk to external sources, whether, particularly within our organization, we are developing support for those new ideas that we're coming up with. So if your team is developing a new product, that product is going to die if nobody else in the organization says, yes, that's a good idea. So developing support for the new product or new process that you're proposing is critical, and that is done through external communication. But communication within the team is also important. What we're finding is that when we talk about communication, not all communication is created equal. So a lot of the early studies looked at frequency and got very mixed results. What we're finding is that, really, not surprisingly, it's important to look at the nature of that communication. So in several studies, collaborative communication was found to be related to creativity and positively, but negative forms of communication, like being harshly criticized, belittled, ridiculed, and so on, hinder creativity. Not surprising, but again, it's important to pay attention to that. Importantly, one of the things that we're finding is that communication is sort of the underlying source for much of what happens later. So I'm moving to talk about trust and psychological safety. And again, what we find is that it's linked to creativity and innovation. So teams that have a high degree of trust, that have and feel psychologically safe, tend to have more creative ideas and develop those creative ideas and reach the innovation stage. I also want to debunk a particular myth about psychological safety. Psychological safety received a lot of attention in recent years because of a study by Google. So they studied their own teams, and they found that psychological safety was the differentiator between successful teams and not successful teams. So that's when everybody started to say, oh, this is a really important construct, it's really relevant. But there's also been misinterpretation of what psychological safety means. In this particular, not in this particular context, in all contexts, psychological safety does not mean being nice, or being nice to be nice. In a psychological safe environment, team members feel safe to be their authentic self, which means they can also criticize. And that's critical for creativity. They are willing to discuss information openly, which is critical for creativity. We cannot develop ideas if people just agree with everything that is being said. Ideas will not improve that way. So there's this, in some circles, there's this notion that psychological safety means that you're supposed to be nice to your colleagues, and that's always good to be nice, but it also means that when you are providing criticism, you want to do it in a nice way. Not that you don't provide criticism. It's that you're thoughtful and do it in a way that does not harm the team communication and other team members' thoughts and feelings. What we're also finding is that when team members have low trust in each other, it facilitates the creation of disagreements, partly because when we have ambiguous information, and many times in team problem solving, when teams work together, we have a lot of ambiguous information, and we tend to immediately interpret it in a negative way. So instead of giving people the benefit of the doubt, we immediately jump to conclusion that something is wrong or something is bad when we have low trust. So, and that creates disagreements and conflict. So going into conflict, the literature basically suggests that we can have two kinds of conflict. Conflict can be task-based, that is, we disagree about how to do the task or what the task is that the team needs to focus on. Or it could be relationship-based, which I basically say, I don't like you, right? It has been hypothesized that task conflict may be beneficial for creativity. We're finding mixed results. Relationship is always negative, so relationship conflict is always bad. Task conflict gets mixed results. And Drew suggested the possibility of a curvilinear relationship. He actually found it, meaning that too little task conflict is not good. You're not providing criticism. The idea cannot be improved. Too much task conflict actually becomes relationship conflict. If all you do is criticize, people feel attacked. It's that middle level where you're criticizing the idea, but not so much, where people can actually work with your criticism and develop, further develop the idea. Importantly, as you've seen from this conversation here, those social processes are interrelated and have interactive effects. So low trust can lead to disagreement and conflict. Communication increases trust and psychological safety, but it's a circular thing. Trust and psychological safety also have been shown to increase communication. And everything that we do in a team requires collaboration and communication. So this becomes really important because we try in research to separate trust from communication, from conflict, and it's not that simple because they're all interrelated. It's also important to note that we need to think about this dynamically. We don't have a ton of research on it, but these social processes develop and change over time. And not only do they develop and change over time, so for example, we know that team demographic diversity may hinder communication early on, but as people get to know each other on the team, that seems to get to improve over time. But also, these social processes can have different effects depending on the timing within the project. So low trust may have a different effect if you're talking about early on in the project or later in the project. So with that, that gives me a nice segue to move on to what are these different processes that are happening within the project, not the social processes, but moving to the cognitive processes as the project develops. So when we talk about cognitive processes, we're talking about two aspects. Social cognition, which is important, but I don't have time to talk about everything. So that one is I'm going to put to the side. It is highly relevant. It is important. And this basically is how individuals and teams think about the teams and team processes themselves. So for example, do you know who on your team knows what? But then we have the problem-solving processes that we all know that relate, we start at the individual and the individual goes through a series of processes. And we could talk about those at the team level as well. The cognitive processes, again, received a lot more attention at the individual level than the team level. We're starting to see some work at the team level. Again, the work that I've been doing is taking those individual models of cognitive processes and elevating them and aggregating them to the team level to see how they are aggregated, which is not something that we have a clear picture on. A lot of the work that people talk about when they say we're talking about cognition in teams is really social cognition. some of these relate to the two that I want to talk about here a little bit are shared mental models and reflexivity, which are particularly important for creativity. Shared mental models are really representations of knowledge and beliefs that are shared about by the team members. And we see positive relationship with team creativity and innovation for shared mental models. But we also see a negative relationship, because if you have a high degree of shared mental models, it means that you have a high degree of similarity in terms of how you think, the knowledge that you have, and that can lead to conformity and also just not thinking outside the box. On the other hand, shared mental models can help in developing trust, because you know that team members think about similarly to you, and allow for it, sharing information openly, and that's typically when we see positive effect for shared mental models. But again, there's very limited research, and identifying shared mental models has become a really difficult proposition. It's actually one of the hardest things to do in teams research, which is why I think you don't have as much research on it. Team reflexivity is really something that is gaining attention. It's probably one of my favorite topics right now. When team members reflect on the objectives and strategies and then adapt them to current or anticipated circumstances, that's what we call team reflexivity. And basically what we find is that reflexive teams can change their strategies, they can learn from past mistakes, and therefore it is important for team creativity and innovation. Now, a lot of the research has suggested that teams that are naturally reflective will be more creative. A lot of the work has focused on what is actually happening in the field, not so much how do we facilitate team reflexivity directly. But unfortunately, it does not occur naturally. It's, our natural tendency is to go from fire to fire, put out the current fire, move on to the next fire. We solved that problem. We're not going to sit down and talk about how it went. We actually just finished a study. We have a project from NSF to study all of these things and the interactions between team processes and the different team processes. And as part of that project, we had teams come to the lab and engage in a creative problem-solving effort. Half of the teams received a tutorial on how to engage in team reflexivity and actually walked through the process for the problem they just solved. And then half of the team received an email, watched a video instruction on how to write a proper email, which was very boring. And then we gave them another problem-solving exercise. And we found that the teams that engaged in reflection did a whole lot better in terms of creativity, came up with more creative solutions to the second problem compared to the teams that were not. So obviously you can instruct teams and teach them how to engage in this process, and it does facilitate creativity. We are now testing to see what sort of behavioral change actually occurred since we videotaped the teams and we could code the behaviors. That is a very long process, as my students can attest. Very painful. When we talk about creative problem solving, depending on the model that you look at, you could see anywhere from 3 to 8 different steps. Obviously, one of my passions is problem construction, problem identification, so I'm definitely going to talk about that. Information gathering is already mentioned, is relevant in particular for teams. There's a ton of research on idea generation, and teams, we call it brainstorming, right? So there we really did our work. And then what do we do with all of those ideas? We need to evaluate those solutions. We need to make a decision which of those solutions we're going to continue to work with, implement, and so on. So what is missing here? Again, our models are on individual cognition. We're starting to move to team cognition models. We're starting to get research on those things beyond just brainstorming, but we're not there yet, in my opinion, in terms of the actual research. What happens when team members need to put together these individual cognitions? How are they aggregated? And particularly for this early and late processes, what happens before and after idea generation? As I said, we have a lot of work already on brainstorming, so I'm not so worried there. It's the other stuff. So during the problem construction, at least at the individual level, we say that there are 3 parts. We recognize that there is a problem to be solved. We define the problem, and then we construct it. What are the parameters that would facilitate problem solving, and particularly creative problem solving? At the individual level, we know that past experiences with similar problems create structures in memory called problem representation, which include goals, constraints, or restrictions, basically what you cannot do, any information that is needed, and all the procedures and processes we use to solve the problem. We also know from the individual level research and cognition is that when we see problem to a similar one that we solved in the past, we tend to apply that problem representation automatically. It's not something that we even realize that we're doing. Again, at the individual level, we find that creative individuals and experts spend more time in problem construction. Go back to Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi's really seminal study on artists. We find that deliberately engaging in problem construction, telling people to engage in problem construction, spending more time on problem construction improves creativity. And then that when people focus on the goals and the restrictions, we see improvement in creativity. But at the team level, we really have very limited research. So how do teams construct problems? Well, again, thinking about the individuals within the team, we could have people that are thinking about the problem in a similar way, and therefore we all agree what the problem is. Or we could have different constructions, something that was dubbed RGAP by Matt Cronin and Lori Weingart. If we have a team that is more homogeneous, we're more likely to think about the problem similarly. A heterogeneous team is more likely to have different constructions. And sometimes you can identify that that is happening, again, because we do this automatically. People start to fight over what the solution is when in fact they don't agree on what the problem is in the first place. So some of the work on large differences in how we construct the problem suggests that you don't have a middle. You have either teams that do very, very poorly because they disagree on what the problem is. They have increased conflict and lower creativity. But if differences are discussed, it leads to increased creativity. So you lose that middle portion. You either have really poor performance or really high performance when you have these diverse teams with different conceptualizations. We also find that when we tell teams to engage in problem construction, sometimes they were less creative because they couldn't reach agreement, but most of the time, and that they tend to come up with more original ideas. But more importantly, or equally importantly, they report lower conflict and increased satisfaction with the process and outcome as a result of engaging in the actual process of discussing what they think this problem needs to be. When we talk about information gathering and information sharing, it's a cognitive process that really relies on a social process of communication. You cannot share information without communicating with each other. We find that individuals search within and outside of the team for information, so within themselves and within the team. And as mentioned before, diverse teams have access to more information and more diverse information. What is interesting is that we don't have a ton of research on this process. We know that common information is more likely to be shared, right? So we actually need to discuss the things that we don't have in common and the information that we don't share in common, but we end up talking about the information that we do share. We don't always know what information we have that is relevant to other people. So sometimes we don't provide that information because we don't know it's relevant. And again, there are no direct studies on information gathering and sharing on creativity. There's research on open communication and sharing communication that way and sharing information that way, but not about how gathered information is related to creativity. When we move to solution evaluation and solution selection, again, we have limited research both at the individual and team level. We have more information at the individual level, some at the team level now. So again, when we generate ideas, we come up with a lot of different ideas. We're trying to evaluate which should be used or rejected. What we find is that creative individuals tend to recognize creativity, so they're more likely to choose creative ideas. That standards for evaluation likely come from the problem construction stage, so from the goals and restrictions that we identified up front. The domain can influence the process. Are we evaluating throughout the process or just at the end? Instructions to choose creative ideas don't necessarily work. Sometimes they lead to choosing creative ideas. Sometimes they lead to original ideas, but of low quality, which is not what we're looking for. And we find that teams are not very good at selecting creative ideas. We've done probably 3 or 4 studies on this, and I think the best that we got was through a lot of research, instructions and manipulations. We got teams to select either creative ideas or at least good ideas, maybe not creative, but high quality ideas, 70% of the time. That was our best. So 30% of the time they chose ideas that were judged as poor ideas, low quality, low originality, which is not comforting when you realize how many decisions are made by committees. What we do find is that providing structure during this process leads to better evaluation, accuracy, so people are more likely to evaluate accurately the quality and originality of the idea, and then better idea selection as a result. Because nobody sits around and goes, oh, this is a really bad idea, I'm going to choose this. They choose bad ideas because they think they're good ideas. So the problem starts with, how do you evaluate the ideas in a more accurate way? As I mentioned, we really have sparse research on problem-solving processes. Cognitive processes in teams rely on social processes. That's the beauty of what's happening in teams, right? You cannot identify the cognitive processes unless the team communicates. We have evidence that both similarity in cognition and diversity in cognition can be important. And importantly, what we are finding is that when the social deficits, so those issues of communication and trust and psychological safety and reduced conflict can be overcome, we see that the cognitive benefits of diverse teams really can facilitate team creativity. And the two ways that we typically overcome those social deficits are by effective leadership and by time, where team members get to know each other. And I want to stop here to allow for time for questions and so forth. I know I went really fast. I just want to put a plug in. Here's my contact information if you want to reach me. I'm going to leave it on the screen for a little bit. But I am the editor of a book series from Palgrave called Creativity and Innovation in Business and Organizations. If any of you, we are publishing both edited books, a sole author or a full book that you wrote, both for more an academic audience, but also more practitioners. So if you have an idea for a book, please reach out. I'm happy to chat with you about it. And now I'm done.
Round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Reiter Palnon. Thank you, Roni. What's going to happen next is we're going to open it up to our two panelists, but I did want to make a quick commentary on here. You talked about your unit of analysis from individual to team. That was the unit of analysis that we did when we did my studies, when we compared teams training creative problem solving and not training creative problem solving. And I'm very aware, and we videotaped them, I'm very aware of the tedious task that goes on when you need to go through all that videotaping. My goodness, we watched videotapes for hours and counted and counted. And I'm also going to make a conjecture out there that I think that you would probably agree with this, that something like the creative problem solving process probably does help to moderate weaknesses in diverse teams. So yeah, and that's, I think, some of the things that we found as well, because we essentially structure teams to be diverse, and the moderating factor in there is creative problem solving. So that's my contribution to this. I've been watching the chat. There's some great stuff in the chat. Thank you for that. But what I'd like to do next is I'd like to have our two panelists respond to this. And the way we're going to do this is we'll have you respond one at a time. And Dr. Tilster, we're going to have you respond first. Take about 5 minutes, and then I'll kind of interrupt in there, and then we'll have Laura Swatowski respond, and then we'll open it up for the rest of the time. I'll be watching the chat, and perhaps the 3 or 4 of us could have a bit of a chat around that. So, Dr. Tilster, I'd like to introduce you first. Dr. Karen Tilster is the founder and president of the Creativity Effect. And over the past 10 years, she's created innovation labs and developed design thinking teams for healthcare systems, government agencies, universities, and Fortune 500 companies. Karen designed the first design thinking innovation lab in healthcare, dear to my heart, professional sports, and county government. She also designed the nation's first undergraduate degree in innovation and social entrepreneurship. I love that, at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. Dr. Tilster is a co-creator of the Orchard Model of Innovation. She serves as a faculty member for universities in the United States and Asia. She's a visiting professor of Advent Health University and served as executive fellow for innovation at Santa Clara University from 2015 to 2020. What is it, you people? You're just always working. I love it. She served on innovation advisory boards in both the USA and Europe. Karen is a licensed educational psychologist, holds a PhD in creative leadership. Native Californian, Karen has authored 2 books, The Death Line and 100 Ways to Ignite Collaboration, Critical Thinking with Teams of Any Size, which is absolutely pertinent to what we're talking about here. So Dr. Karen Tilster, please, you have the monitor.
Those bios always sound so much more amazing than they really are.
You know, they do, but it is amazing. I mean, when you step back and you start to look at this stuff that you've done, it's just like, this is stuff that we do because we love to do it. You know, it's like, oh man, that's fun. Let's do that. Let's do that. So let's have some fun. Talk to us a little bit about your comments from Dr. Reiter Palnon. Building on that, we'll talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll go over to Laura Swatowski.
But first off, thanks, Roni. That was awesome. I love that you really had said some really very clear, powerful things. And Roger, I love your definition of expert, because I do work in creativity, but I usually don't just consider myself an expert. I have to books. And Roger and his team helped me when I was in my doctoral program. I don't know if you remember me. I came up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I've learned a little since then. But anyway, what I wanted to do is just respond to some things that Roni's slides and words really made me think about. What I kind of wanted to put how I applied some of those things. So with working with organizational innovation labs, it really became vital that teams creativity in teams was where it was at. And we had to really, I developed a kind of a soundbite that said, and we all agree with this, so it's not anything rocket science. Everyone's creative with leadership potential. And we started saying that when we developed the first innovation lab in Advent Health, a large healthcare system throughout Southern America. And people would say, oh, no, not me. I'm not creative. I don't have leadership potential. And then we realized we needed to work with the leaders to get them to start using the words, everybody has permission and responsibility to their own creativity. And as we built different organizational innovation labs and started to train teams to work in those labs and to take what they learned in the lab out to their areas, that became a really important thing, permission and responsibility. And every time we tried to break it down, and it was like Roni said, if the teams can't communicate internally and externally, people just, hierarchy would work against them, even if it was a good hierarchy. Hierarchy tends to work against creativity anyway. But then we began to bring some of Margaret Wheatley's, like conversation is still the best problem solving tool. And we developed a couple other sound bites as we were developing the lab and the teams. And we started just to push these sound bites out. One is conversation is still the best problem solving tool. People care what their people want to create. They're responsible when they do create. They care about what they create. And then we also started to give really important time to the role of feedback along with conversation, and started sharing that there was no such thing as bad feedback, that feedback was a critical part of the communication in creativity. And people started saying, well, tell us more, what is feedback? And that it just simply is information. And the reason I'm sharing this is I felt it was just a really great example of what Roni was saying when you start really teaching people, because you can tell people, we got to be creative. We have to get out there externally and internally, but the hierarchy will prevent it from happening, even the most courageous person. And then we started to, we did a lot of design thinking teaching, and a lot of the courses we did, every time a project came in or someone came, we always taught with it. And one thing we started to teach is to understand your own creativity and enhance others, was that we all are born or have within us curiosity, compassion, and courage. And those things kind of can get pushed to the side with hierarchy. But if we start to educate people along that and how they might support that, it becomes really exciting. And people it gets into the collective consciousness, and people start, yeah, I guess that is true. I do remember I was really curious at one point in time. So I started working here, and then how it can go. But, and we kept tying it back into everybody has permission and responsibility. But we had to work with the top leaders to continue to share that in town halls and in forums, in summits, wherever and as that language started to happen, our innovation lab and the innovation lab team could start to really roll that out. And then we did one little example. It was just a fun little example. We also realized that an organization won't by themselves, with the hierarchy in place, just allow for conversation when it comes to creativity. So we created this thing we called the meat grinder, and we did a little study on it, and not meat like in meat, but MEET. And that was, we worked with the leaders and said, could we just try this and see if it would work? So a meat grinder is a special kind of moment when a group, a team, an innovation project team has a question that they need to talk about with a top leader, a middle manager that they really don't have access to. And as you know, the hierarchies in some places more than others. Healthcare tends to be really big on this. You have to talk to the assistant manager, then they talk to the manager, and they talk to the assistant director, up it goes. So the person, by the time it gets to the top, it's a little distorted. So we got the leaders to say, can we have these 5-minute meat grinders? So say someone's on a team, say we were on an innovation team and we needed to get some information from the top leader. We could call a meat grinder, 5-minute meetings, standing in a hallway or in no one sitting down. And there's a very clear question that's being asked of the leader or information. You need some information at 5 minutes or 4 minutes. It's over. Everyone goes about their way. We didn't know if it would work. And at first, some of the VPs, they like, we can't do this. This is just ridiculous. Everything's going to fall apart. But it became so awesome. And people started to understand these. Then we started calling them threshold meetings because people were just standing in doorways of leaders. But it was just amazing what the collaborative bond it started to create. I know I'm sounding kind of like, well, this sounds like la la land, but it actually worked when we put the structure in that we could do what Roni was talking about. Creativity in teams, they have to be able to talk, have to have transparency, have a safe place where it can happen. Otherwise, everyone just sits silently and agrees with the boss, and out at the water cooler, they all say that was a crazy idea. But anyway, that's just what my response was. I could have said, I could go on, but that's an application. But it was fun. Thank you, Roni. It was very interesting.
Karen, thank you so much. I just love the idea of the 5-minute meat MEET grinder. That's just so flexible and it gets people together. And the key is to answer one question. So, Roni, should we go to Laura next, or do you want to do a response to Karen? Or
no, she agreed with what I said. Yeah.
I love you guys.
Yeah, I do love the short meeting because I think part of what we're seeing now with the research on what's happening with meetings and Zoom and so forth is putting those boundaries of, short meetings, having an agenda, knowing exactly what we're going to talk about makes a huge difference.
It takes a lot of the pressure off. It fosters creativity. It's all the good stuff about it. So wonderful. I'd like to introduce next Laura Swatowski. Laura is a partner of Darwin and Associates, which is a consulting firm here in Buffalo, New York, specializing in organizational development and creativity training and facilitation. Laura works with organizations across North America, Central America, and Europe, and her work is to enhance leadership and teamwork, facilitate creativity and innovation, and help manage change and transitions. As a social psychologist and expert in consumer communication research, Laura has a quantitative market research background with more than 20 years of experience, adjunct faculty member here at the Center for Applied Imagination, and one of the co-founders and a board member of CREAT Conference, a big favorite, and a longtime leader of the annual Creative Problem Solving Institute, CIPSE. So, and a dear friend. So, Laura, please, over to you. Let's hear from your perspective on this.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Roni and Karen. And Roni, I really, find your presentation, your keynote, very interesting in many different aspects. There is so much, and so I'm going to try to to just pinpoint the few things that struck me. I love, by the way, the distinction you made between social processes and cognitive processes. That's really interesting. What I'm bringing here more is my practitioner, experience. Although I am part of the faculty at the Center of Applied Imagination, but my work has been fundamentally on the ground, with a lot of leaders and teams and working on that, Karen's work. And the first point for me is to reflect on how all this research that has been we talk about last decade, and I saw the whole incredible studies on teams are really how the evolution of what we are right now with the impact of the pandemic and COVID-19 and where teams are working right now more in a remote environment or in a hybrid situation. So it's really how all these processes are impacted from a social perspective as well as from the cognitive perspective. So my reflection was I was thinking, I went back this morning to look at an article from Harvard Business Review in 2016 that talk about the 4D teams. And these teams are diverse, dispersed, digital, and dynamics. Okay, so and dynamics, we are discovering that dynamics also means they are changing constantly. That's one of the big challenge of teams today, that there is not that stability in company, in organization. You might go, you transit on a team, and you are there for 6 months or a year, and then you are gone. So that affects obviously trust, right? The setting the trust, this whole issue about the time and leaving the time for the team to form and to be able to trust each other. So that is a critical element of teams that are dispersed and they are dynamic. They are changing constantly and onboarding new people. That's part of, if we're talking about a stable team, then we talk about the project teams, like, you refer to them. What is the time you have on a project? These are like, work streams, like so-called in organization. I'm gonna work on that for 3 months and then I'm out because it's cross-functional. And so how do you put all these things together, in terms of, so it's a lot. And right now with the effect of the pandemic, so I did a little research on my side with my colleague Marija Starkey in 2020 about the effect of the pandemic on organizational creativity. So doing a qualitative studies, like, interviewing 22 executives around, like, North America, Central America, and Europe, and just understanding what was going on, right? And it was interesting to see that there were a lot of things that were going on in terms of how resilient and resourceful people are, and teams rally together to do things. And on the other hand, when we get ourselves in the remote work, which is our reality for many, and has a lot of benefits, there is also a lot of problem in that setting of the trust outside, especially not in the close team, but in the outside, in the ability to talk with other people who are not directly with your team, external communication, you were saying, for example, and creating more silos. That's the one of the problem that we are having and we are seeing with teams right now, that they might become more cohesive in a dispersed world, but more silos on the other world in their way they are communicating with each other. And one interesting thing that struck me about your presentation, I'm trying to put it together, social processes and cognitive processes, is that there are 3 elements typically, especially with dispersed teams, that are critical, and they are communication, so conflict, right? And the third one is decision making. Now, and I think the decision making, as you put it into is a cognitive process about evaluating ideas, doing things like that. At the same time, is a social process. So let's connect with current hierarchy, right? And the whole problem of leadership and power, like, how decision is made and how teams are able to be able to have these debates that are conducive to good decision making. I see, whether are in person or digital, a lot of struggle of team in the convergent and decision making process, much more than in the idea generation process. That's in the divergent process. That is okay. We have the tools, so we can get them generating things. But when it comes time to make decision, to align, to converge, that is always the critical, the crucible of teams, in my view. And that is becoming even a little more difficult in the remote environment, because the remote environment, through the pandemic impact, has pushed him a lot to productivity and efficiency, and that's not necessarily equal creativity. And that means, do we have the time to spend to discuss the problem construction? That's absolutely a brilliant point. And if we do that, of course, then we become less conflict and more satisfied, as you said. At the same time, many organizations don't really leave this time. And so the whole circle back is leadership, right? It's working with leadership who is enlightened and understand the importance of process and constructing this process to give teams the opportunity to thoroughly discuss and debate as being a little going down through the pandemic and the impact because of the pandemic, because was the time of debating, the time of really having robust discussion that are not artificial harmony and artificial alignment. So psychological safety, as you were saying, this is not being nice, right? It's about saying what you think, but sometimes it's difficult to do that, and even more so in the digital environment. So a lot of things, and Roger, I think I'm going maybe even beyond the 5, so please stop me. And I usually say, oh, Laura, you can come because you can talk about anything for 5 minutes. So I said, okay, I will talk about anything, but somebody has to stop me, right? So
well, Laura, this is a great jumping off point. I'd like to, Roni, do you want to respond to Laura? I've got a couple of questions that we might tee up on, and why don't we build on that? And I'd like to build on what Laura had to say. And I think all of us that have done work facilitating groups and working in teams and idea generation and evaluation. And one of the things I always tell my students is, if you have an hour meeting, spend about 10 minutes generating ideas and the rest of the time evaluating ideas, because the convergent phase takes so much more time. And there's reasons for that, people having discussions about those sorts of things. And so Laura mentioned the, quote, the struggle in the convergent process, which is something we've all experienced. Here's a question that goes to your comments, Roni, about construction. And this is so the question is, does evaluation accuracy mean keeping criteria of success prominent in the evaluation stage? What are your thoughts on detailed criteria limiting creativity, or does it help idea selection on target in teams?
Yeah. So what we're finding is that when you remind people of the criteria, and so it's like, on the one hand, when they generate we want them to forget what those criteria are, right?
Right.
Go and generate, don't censor, don't think about what's correct, incorrect, or doable or feasible. But then in the idea generation, we sort of have to remind them again of those criteria, or you can't, there are a whole bunch of ideas that you can immediately typically rule out because they're not feasible or they're too expensive, and so on. So I think we found it to be useful to remind people of those criteria, and have them and sometimes what we do, and that seems to work well, is sort of go, let's say we're using the criteria of quality and originality, doing them separately. So your view of one does not taint the other. And now let's look at the ideas that are the highest quality as well as highest originality. We could have other criteria included as well. Sometimes it's like ease of implementation. We start to break down, like ease of implementation, or how quickly we could move from idea to implementation, which sometimes is important, right? Because if it's going to take you 10 years to develop something, but you need a quick win, so there might be some other criteria that are supersedes those. But we find that to be incredibly helpful in the idea generation, in the idea evaluation phase. The other thing that we find helpful is to find ways to quickly reduce, because in brainstorming, it's not uncommon. I don't know your experience, but I've had teams generate 100, 150 ideas in like 10 minutes.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And evaluating 100 or 150 ideas is just not possible. No. I don't care how much time you have.
Yeah.
So immediately either getting rid of ideas or putting similar ideas together in categories. So you can just look at the category and go, okay, we have 10 ideas here, but we really want to focus on these 2.
Yes. And so a couple of things to that. That's the experience we've had also is, and one of the things that we're using to evaluate those ideas is the highlighting technique. Go through first, mark the hits, interesting, intriguing, useful, see which of them cluster together, and then evaluate those. I'm also reminded of the early creative problem solving process, and Dr. Udis, I think, is familiar with this as well. When Sid would talk about fact finding, problem finding, idea finding, solution finding, and acceptance finding. And in solution finding, what Sid would do was we would create a matrix, all right? So first come up with all these criteria, select the important criteria, select ideas against that. And you got to be pretty precise on that. but that was a whole half day in itself on that. So
Right.
that's why we invented things like highlighting and pluses and potentials and concerns. Great stuff. Let's see. Next question, great, is how do we inspire creative, efficient, and effective communication among teams across sectors, private, nonprofit, law enforcement, and geography, without various backgrounds and experiences?
That's the $1 million question,
Yeah.
or maybe it's even more. And that's some of the stuff we're trying to study. And I think Laura hit the nail on the head. We have seen a radical shift in how teams are communicating and doing work, and with COVID, and I think we have to be careful. One of the things that I like to remind everybody is that all the research that we've done during COVID, those conclusions are great for COVID, but we have to remember that when we're moving, let's say now when COVID is not so prominent, and some of the other issues like school closures and having kids at home and, worried about, an unknown disease as opposed to a more known disease, all of those things don't hover in the background anymore. So what the day looks like if you're working remotely is very different, right? So if you don't have little kids interrupting your work every 5 minutes, that's a different condition than when you do. So a lot of the work that we've done during COVID is interesting, but I'm not sure how much it applies. Some of what we learned we can apply, but I think it's different. And
Yes.
We have to really pay attention to what's going on. The research has not kept up, unfortunately. I will make a plea to all of you that are doing applied work. Collaborate with researchers. We love this kind of data. We can't always get into organizations easily. We need that data. We need that data to give good instructions and good directions to organizations about how to structure the next phase. I also think that, the rapid change we're seeing in collaboration tools, if you think about using Zoom and what we've used Zoom and what was available on Zoom 5 years ago, it's, I work with computer engineers, and they're like, the biggest thing they had problems with and they liked face-to-face meetings is because of the whiteboard. I need to draw my stuff. Well, we have it now.
Sure
right?
do. Right.
It made a huge difference for them. Now they're going, okay, we can do this online. We couldn't before.
Right.
So, again, even just looking at research that was done, I stumbled across a paper that looked at, the only one that I found that looked at idea generation versus idea evaluation online, and was done in 2011.
Yeah.
The tools are so different now.
Yeah. It's just extraordinary, Ronnie. I mean, the work that we're doing with our good colleague, Dr. David Yates, we're using Mural, and you can simulate a whole room there. And the beauty of that is we're able to do work and increase the diversity of a team when we're working on a particular challenge, because we don't have to do all the expense of bringing them together. And the results are extraordinary. We just completed some work with an organization based in New York, but we had people all over the Western Hemisphere contributing to that. It was an amazing experience. One of my colleagues, Dr. Larry Kiley, who does a lot of work in the area of leadership, essentially says that based on COVID and now that we're doing all this remote and collaborative work, is that essentially leadership is upside down, and no longer are the leaders in charge, it's the followers, or no longer are the faculty in charge, it's the students. And so that, I think, makes a big difference as far as how we work together in teams. And Ronnie, I wonder if you might want to comment on that, or Karen or Laura, kind of the flip of leadership. So
well, one of the things,
Ronnie, go ahead. Yeah,
one of the things that I noticed is when I talk to leaders, the ones that want to go back to face-to-face, in particular, it's because they don't know how to lead online.
Wow.
We've never given them the tools. We've never taught them, right? They go and get an MBA, and if their MBA was from 20, 30 years ago, they know how to lead face-to-face teams. They're very uncomfortable leading online. I think I haven't thought about it as the upside down, but I think that's an interesting way to think about it, and
Yes.
potentially part of the reason they're incredibly uncomfortable.
Yes, yes, yeah. Laura, Karen, do you want to chime in on that? Or
I have a comment on something that Roni just said, and I tie to yesterday keynote, right? That's that we saw yesterday about emotional intelligence. That is a critical element, still a critical element of leadership at all levels. It could be your supervisor, your manager, and it's critical because also showing behavior of emotional intelligence online. We haven't been taught, right, to do that in person. And what about online? What about when the time is running and we are in this digital environment where we are not physically present in the same room? And I totally agree with the greatest, the great things of having all these tools right now and the remote environment that is here to stay. But certainly, I think that leadership challenge still exists of being able to be comfortable, to be empathic, to be able to show that also in the offline and online. And that's also, by the way, just the only, I wasn't referring just when I talk about the impact of the pandemic. I totally agree with you. There are no really studies right now about that. But for me, is the new world that we have now that is going to stay hybrid, is going to have all these remote, and how teams are going to really effectively work. And how leadership, as Roger, you say, is going to impact that, because of course we also have more autonomous teams, more agile teams. So this is really upsetting a little bit the whole hierarchy, right, that we used to have before, and even in how we make a decision and how we do that. So there is a very interesting evolution on where we are going and into the complexity. So fascinating.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Karen, and then we'll go back to Roni, and then we'll wrap it up. We have some announcements and stuff as well. Karen, you want to jump in on that?
Before COVID, we didn't do anything online. We said, no, everything.
Yeah.
When COVID hit, we were working with three very large organizations, one a university, one a healthcare system, one a government agency. And we just said, we got to do it. And so because I have younger people I work with, one of them said, well, there's this mural, like you mentioned, Roger.
There's this mural thing. Yeah, okay. Whoa, what's that? Yeah.
Just gotta do it. What was so amazing, because we really were moving against a idea that leaders had, that who are you to work from home? This right. Goes against our thinking, and this is for privilege. And that we kept hearing that. We said, okay, but we got to do it. So we started. I got a little proficient in mural thanks to the younger people on my team. We started teaching it, and then people started saying, "Oh, are you working for mural?" We said, "Nope," but we got different counties in Florida on licenses for mural. We got the healthcare system in the mural, and it became very important for us to start doing some trainings. It's not scary, just think a little different way. And I feel like that was what made the difference, because leaders, they just had to get new skills. And there was one group we worked with, it was a private company, and they were desperate. And when they learned about mural, they started realizing, okay, there are tools that are very up to date, and we can do the same things. We just have to embrace the change. We have to just embrace it. And I think mural, the mural's from the US, Miro is from China. So I know some companies didn't want to use mural, but mural is US based. And I was so grateful for the young people stepping in and saying, we can do this. Remember Skype way back when?
Skype, right.
But, now that some of the groups are going back to okay, we got to go back to the office 4 days a week or 3 days a week. There are conversations. I think it's really cool. Do we need to? If we do, let's think about, let's just not go back to what we did. Let's start a new way. And I really think when change happens, what experts in creativity can do is really look to young people to help us with the technology, because that's really what changes moves the needle, I think. And I saw it straight up. And then the options for large companies who have offices around, like county offices are all over the place. Mm-hmm. What it did for them to solve other problems, that just to getting together so they don't have to drive a half hour,
Right.
It was awesome. I mean, it was a learning curve. And
Mhm.
I'm a big proponent of it now. And I think there's not for everything, because we
Right.
do face to face. It's important. But when it's not, when you can do it virtually, there is some power. And then you automatically save all your notes in Mural, as you know, Roger, you can save
It's
it.
beautiful. Yeah. So a couple of things to that. I mean, this conference is made possible because of Zoom and Mural. I mean, it's very simple, and it
Yeah.
has grown, and the reach is greater than we could ever do, because here we are sitting in our offices or our home offices having these conversations. It's extraordinary. A couple of things that I'd like to mention around that. First off, I just want to do a shout out to Dr. David Yates, our Mural tech expert, who's actually behind the scenes, busily working away. He's kind of down in the engine room now, putting coal into the steam into the but one of the things we also found too is that when we have meetings and when we're teaching, we separate a time first to do technical training. And so we'll spend about an hour or so on, here's Mural, here's how to play in it. So then when we do get into the meeting, people aren't saying, well, how do I do this? Or they're moving a Mural around. So we found it very, very helpful to separate the technical side out from when we're really doing business done. Roni, I'm gonna toss it to you in just a second, but I just want to also say there's some wonderful things in the chat right now, wonderful resources in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, please do. So Roni, let's go over to you and just any concluding comments, and then I'll take us into our break in the afternoon.
Absolutely. So I think part of what we need to remember that a lot of what we have learned from the past about what works and what doesn't work to facilitate team creativity comes from face-to-face teams.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that we don't have the tools yet to simulate. So for example, those chance encounters that happen by the water cooler or the coffee pot, or as you sit next to somebody you don't know in a big meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying we don't have them yet. Right. So I think part of our job as creativity experts is to say, what are those things that facilitate creativity? And then how can we make them appear in the online version? We know how to make them happen in the in person. What does it look like? And it may look very different online. We may decide after a lot of trial and error that we can't do that. And that's where face-to-face becomes really important. But I'm not willing to throw the baby with the bathwater and just say, oh, we can't have the water cooler chat. So everybody needs to be at the office 5 days a week. Because really, when you drive an hour and a half in traffic to get to the office and you're stressed about going home and not spending time with your family, I don't know that you could be effective and more creative that way either.
Excellent point. A couple of things here. Dr. Michael Ackerbauer just did a shameless pitch for his 12:15 social styles session. We'll take a look at affective and cognitive aspects of this. The other thing that's too is that we've discussed this when we did our classes and stuff. One of my concerns was, the after class sessions. You go out and have a cocktail together. You go out and have dinner together. You're having meals together. That's one of the challenges that happens in this environment. But Roni, to your point, we've also found it helpful to do a hybrid, of course, a little of both. So part of a problem-solving meeting will be, let's meet together with the team first, get everybody on stage, everybody together first, and then break up into the virtual area. So, Roni, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Just a round of applause for Dr. Reiter Palnon, please. And once again, please take a look in the chat. There's wonderful resources there.
Absolutely.
A couple of things that are also in the chat is we have our schedule for this afternoon. And if we can bring that up, we'll just take a look at that. The other thing that we have as well in the chat is we have the links for our March program orientation. And we also have our links to the sessions this afternoon in the chat. So just to have a little conversation about that is we will take a break now until 12:15 New York time. This afternoon, we'll have creativity and conflict management. Here we go. Thank you, Dr. Yates. He's so silent, but just effective. Stealth. All right. We'll have our first concurrent session this afternoon from 12:15 to 1 on creativity and conflict management, healing-centered practices, how acting skills can benefit emotional wellness, creative journey of an emergency physician, social styles and how to read them. Oh, is that by Dr. Ackerbauer? All right, and then at 1:15, the second bunch of concurrent sessions will be co-creating with artificial intelligence, the challenge navigator, drivers of invention, mindset, neuroscience, and creative cognition, Asian American creativity, 3 perspectives on creativity and well-being. My goodness, what a fabulous afternoon. And then at 2 o'clock to 2:15, we'll wrap up in your concurrent session rooms. We will not go back to the main room. Mark your calendar for March 7th and 8th for Creativity Expert Exchange. All the chats are, you can save the chat as well, and all of the information that we talked about today is still in the chat. We will leave this room open so that you can continue conversations as we have a break. Anything from my colleagues at the Center for Applied Imagination? Then we stand adjourned until 12:15 New York time. Karen, Laura, Ronnie, thank you all so very much. Thank you all for your participation. It's an absolute pleasure and what a great delight. Thank you.
I'll stay on for a little bit if people want to chat.
Thank you, Ron.